Now, let's talk about key trends in food and beverage. When I think about the food and beverage category, okay, and I'm talking about grocery stores. We're not talking about restaurant or food service. We're just talking about groceries, okay? I see it as a very calm body of water. There's not much going on. Why? Because it's not really growing. And that's because the population isn't growing. And so really what you have to rely on are either gusts of wind or underlying currents, okay? So every once in a while you get that gust of wind, possibly a trend, and all of a sudden that calm water allows, you have the wind and it fills up your sails and you're actually moving along. And it's great to embrace those trends. You know, consumers will be more willing to embrace your product. Customers, who are the retailers, will be willing to accept the product. However, if you go against these trends, you're going to be like a fish swimming upstream. So I'm going to talk about 3 trends. They are, and before I go into this, there are 3 trends, and many of you are thinking, only 3? I've looked at lists of 10 trends, 15 trends in food. These are how I look at them. Now, there could be others. I'm not here to debate what's a trend and what's not a trend, but we can also see what the importance of these trends are. First of all, there's out with the bad. Second, there's in with the good. And then finally, less cooking at home. So let's talk about out with the bad. What I'm talking about are things that are in your food that are bad for you, okay? And that's evolved over time. You know, thinking about the 80s and the early 90s is when we started to have an obesity problem in this country, and people said it was fat. People are getting fat, so it must be the fat in their food. And so consumer packaged goods manufacturers all of a sudden came out with fat-free, low-fat, and light versions of their products. And they replaced the fat, in many cases, with starches, which, interesting to know, is that starches, when they make them with starches, it costs less than with fat. And so these guys were making more money on their fat-free and low-fat products than they were with their full fat. Now, as we know that, you know, it turned out that some fat is good for you, and this, although fat is still very important, people still are watching the fat, and these light and low-fat products are still on the shelves. That's kind of died down. And so going into the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s, we started hearing about Atkins. And, you know, Atkins said, we have to get rid of the carbohydrates out of our diet. You got to get rid of them. So the packaged good manufacturers responded with carb-free products. You had Carb Well and Carb Clever and Carb Style and Carb Killer and all of those products. And this is what you saw on the shelves in the late 90s and early 2000s. But now we've gotten smarter, and we've identified 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These are the 4 bad things that we need to avoid today. They are sugar, anything artificial, GMOs, and gluten. Those are the 4 bads. So let's talk about sugar first. You know, I talked a little bit about when we replace fat with starch. What you don't realize is that's a complex carbohydrate, and carbohydrates are made up of sugar. And so, in fact, what we were doing is, when we were trying to address the obesity epidemic, we were actually probably perpetuating it, because people were getting more carbs in their body and more sugar. And then we also know about soda, which has a huge amount of sugar. We've seen this. I mean, all of a sudden, people are running away from soda. It's bad for you. It's got so much sugar. I think there are between 30 and 40 grams of sugar in a can of Coke. And so the consumers have responded in kind. This is soft drinks. And then you see all the other product, particularly bottled water and even wine and distilled spirits and tea, which are actually growing. So that's the deal with sugar. Nothing artificial. Some people are trying to address the sugar craze by going into artificial sweeteners. But look what's happening to artificial sweeteners. There was actually a news report last week which talked about the fact that artificial sweeteners, you're nodding your head, why is that?
I read it and I was just, it was, everybody I knew was talking about it, and we're like going out and throwing away their artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, artificial sweeteners apparently do something to gut bacteria, which inhibit the ability to process sugars, which are contributing to obesity, which is amazing. And you can see what the effect has been over the past 5 years to artificial sweeteners. And the green, which is growing, is stevia, which is a natural sweetener. It's a natural zero-calorie sweetener. That's the only one that's growing in the category. It's pretty amazing. Who knows what GMO stands for? Genetically modified organism. Basically what you're doing is you're taking a product and you're pulling out some genes and replacing them with other genes. It's usually an agricultural product, almost always an agricultural product. Think seedless watermelon, okay? Of course a seedless watermelon doesn't grow in nature actually unless it's being messed with by a human being, okay? But there are other applications. Products that are resistant to pesticides, so a farmer can throw a lot of pesticides and not worry, resistance to weed killer, so they can throw weed killer, which is going to kill the weeds, but the product isn't going to be affected. Improves yields, all right, is drought resistant. And you can see that some of the key ingredients, corn, soybeans, which means that GMOs are in 80% of all packaged goods today. That's why, because you're in actually corn and soybeans, all right? GMOs are actually growing in the past year alone, GMOs have grown by 28% to a $3 billion category. And you can see that it's become a really big business. You have Kettle brand potato chips with a GMO. You have Annie's toaster pastries, non-GMO, and then Way Better snacks, which also are non-GMO. And so I'm not here to talk about whether GMOs are good for you or bad for you. What I'm here to talk about is if you go non-GMO, that's going to be a nice puff of wind in your sails. What about gluten? Who knows what celiac disease is? It's an autoimmune reaction, causes damage to your intestines. Basically, 2 to 3 million people in America today suffer from celiac disease. That's less than 1% of the population, okay? Another 18 million suffer from gluten intolerance. It's not necessarily celiac disease. They frequently feel that it's causing indigestions. A lot of it is self-diagnosed, and they feel that gluten is bad for them. Other people think that gluten actually is making them fatter, and there's absolutely no science to it. But what you see is gluten is exploding. It's really going up there. And of course, you're starting to see gluten-free products out there. Not only are these new products, but you also have companies like General Mills who has come out with 600 products and labeled them gluten-free. Frequently, the product has been in existence for a very long time. They've just said, hey, we don't have gluten. And that becomes motivating to a consumer.